it out? Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about Tolkien's fantastical geography, and I'm going to start out with just a few facts about Tolkien's life, just a few relevant ones that will tie into the larger themes that I'm discussing, not a whole biography, and I'm not giving you a timeline. I think I only have very few slides as we go through this, just to point out some important moments. So Tolkien was born in 1892 in South Africa, actually, to British parents. His father worked in a bank there. But then Tolkien was very sickly as a child, and so his mother took him and his brother home to England, and unfortunately their father died in South Africa and was never able to rejoin them again. So whether or not this move and this sort of sense of geography and of travel and of empire had a big influence on Tolkien's life or not, I think at least gave him sort of a sense of the largeness of the world, and probably specifically of the largeness of the British Empire as well. But I think it also tied into his very deep love of England and love of place and of the little villages that he grew up in England as well, because those show up in his later writings also. Now, he continued to have a very difficult childhood. His mother then died when he was 12, so he was then an orphan, was taken care of by a priest, raised in an orphanage. He has a fascinating love story that I won't narrate now. If you want, you can ask me later and I'll tell you his love story. It ties into other parts of his mythology that I will not be covering today. But then the two big events of his young life were first going to Oxford to study and trying to study other things for a while before he got put on to English and Old English and other older European languages that really fired his imagination. And then the second big event that changed his life forever was fighting in World War I. He had three very close friends that were friends of his all through his teenage years. They had a club that they started together, and they thought that they were, the four young men who were going to change the world. They were going to do all the great things together. And the one close friend, Rob Gilson, was killed on one of the most terrible days of the Battle of the Somme, and then Tolkien was in that same continuing Battle of the Somme a couple of days later. So he saw the absolute worst action in World War I, and that had a very deep impact on his life, on his thought, and on his writing. Now, obviously, he went on to have a career and do many things after that, but that's where I'm going to stop because we're going to start discussing the foundation of his mythology. Now, for Tolkien, don't be scared by this, I'll explain it. For Tolkien, everything started with and came back to language. Words were what inspired him more than anything else. Everything always started with words for him. Now, if any of you are writers, or if you've studied the way writers go about it, that's kind of unusual. A lot of writers will think of a character first, and they'll have this really dynamic person that they want to tell this person's story. Or they'll think of a really surprising or interesting event. They'll think of the plot first, right? Or maybe the geography first. Maybe they'll think of a place, or if it's a sci-fi writer, maybe a fascinating concept, right? But not so with Tolkien. It always started with words. So here is just a tiny fragment, just 2 lines from an Old English poem that Tolkien encountered in secondary school. And this poem fired his imagination for the rest of his life. So just these 2 lines taken out of context, one possible translation: "Hail Eärendil, brightest of angels, above the middle earth, sent unto men." And this is not explained in the poem. The poem does not tell the story of Eärendil, who he was, what kind of an angel, his story. It's just clear that he's some kind of wanderer and he's something above the ordinary. Now, the word there that's translated angels, and in the context, it seems to indicate that maybe he's actually a star or some kind of heavenly body, like in the sense of a celestial body, rather than an angel in the traditional sense. So, now, if you or I read these lines, we would probably just sort of skip over them and just say, well, I don't know what that is, whatever. We would look for a footnote, right? And if there wasn't one, we would move on. But not so Tolkien. He spent the rest of his life trying to figure out who this character was and what these lines meant. Now, really, he spent the rest of his life making it up, right? Making up the whole backstory. But he didn't really think of it like that. He didn't really think that he was making up all of his mythology. He felt that he was discovering it. He felt that his mythology actually existed somewhere in people's subconscious and in sort of like the little cracks between all the other myths. So he would study all these other myths and find little things that were unexplained, little things that seemed to be missing, especially words that seemed to be missing. He would think, they must have had a word for that once. So he would kind of back formate and figure out what the word could have been, or perhaps according to him should have been, according to actual real laws of language change, because languages change in predictable ways. There are laws that languages follow when they change over time. So Tolkien then worked backwards and made up a language that, given the laws of sound changes, would end up to what we've got now, or end up to those little spaces, those gaps. So here's this one gap about this character, Eärendil. Now in the 19-teens, in around 1914, Tolkien first started writing poetry. He and his 3 friends, before they were killed in the war, got together and had this really powerful writing retreat. They called it the Great Council. And they got together, they had this great council about how they were going to change the world with their poetry. And he came away from that weekend very inspired and decided that he would be a great poet. And so after that, he started writing his first poem about Eärendil being a wanderer, and a seafaring wanderer, a mariner, and leaving England and sailing, but interestingly, sailing north, okay? Sailing north, up around England, around Scandinavia, and other worldwide travels, okay? And then Tolkien went to war. Here's a map of Europe, post-World War I. And then what changes is that his mariner, Eärendil, in the poems after that, sails west instead of north. And where his mariner is sailing to is to find, to put it quite simply, is to find paradise, or to find a heaven on earth, a lost Eden, a lost island of perfection, the land where all of our longings go. So from this point on in Tolkien's writings, evil is always in the east, and the place that you long to get to is always in the west, from this moment on. Now, he didn't make up this idea that there's a magical island in the west, that if only you could get to it, if only you could sail far enough, or if only you had a magical enough ship to sail off the edge of the earth, you could get there. This is a very, very common idea in mythology. It's in several cultures, but primarily in the cultures of the British Isles, and you can kind of see why, right? The little islands on the edge of Europe with nothing beyond them but the great wide ocean. That's an easy place to put imaginary lands, because if you try to travel east, north, or south, they won't fit, because there's already stuff there, usually your enemies, right? So that makes sense. Do any of you know of any of these other legends, where there's some kind of magical island or magical paradise land in the west? Can you think of any of those myths at all? You might even know some that I haven't heard of. What's that?
Was Shangri-La in the west? Or
I don't know that one. Do you know that one?
Yeah, I know it's in the
Right, but is it west of them?
But was it like in the
I think it is.
west of them?
Yeah, well, check it out.
It's supposed to be in China.
Yeah, but isn't it west of where the story is being told? I think so. Yeah, very good. Any others that you can think of? Any legends where there's a magical land, especially an island in the west? Okay, well here are a few. So Hesperus is another name for Venus, or the star in the west. And the Hesperides, there's sort of a whole valence that they cover, either just islands off of Scotland, right? Or the mythical islands associated with Venus in the west. The island of the apples in the King Arthur myths, okay? Tir na Nug, the land of, well, they became the little people, but they were originally much more terrifying magical people in Ireland, right? The forever young, the ever-living people. And then there's another Irish myth, the island of St. Brendan. St. Brendan set off to sail and find paradise, and according to that legend, he found it, and you can go there and see the island of St. Brendan. But then how about Atlantis?
That's to the east, though.
It's to the west of England.
Actually,
It's
believed to
in
be
the Atlantic
Mediterranean.
Ocean. No,
Yeah,
Atlantic Ocean. All right, there must be different threads.
Well, the Pillars of Hercules are at the edge,
Okay,
but then there's also a
All right.
legend that it's off of Greece.
all right, well, in Tolkien, it's in the west.
I know, but,
Yeah.
okay.
Great. There are different threads of all these, so that makes perfect sense as well. But in the British strain of the Atlantis legend, that's where Merlin comes from, and he brings with him all of that magic from the west to England. And then finally, Avalon, the island that King Arthur is taken to at the end of the legend, and from whence he shall return. So there it gets tied up with the island of the apples as well, Avalon. Okay, so those are some legends that Tolkien is tapping into. And then, fascinatingly, we've just learned that Tolkien wrote a King Arthur story. We didn't think so for years. Well, there was a little hint. There were a couple of lines in the biography of Tolkien that he had written this poem and then had put it aside. But it's just been published, and it's actually quite significant. It's over 300 lines complete, and then a whole lot of notes and fragments and other lines that he didn't finish. So throughout the 20s and 30s, he was trying to write a King Arthur poem. And it's in the Beowulf meter. It's in the Anglo-Saxon poetic meter. And it's a really, really powerful poem. Yes, it's unfinished, but what we have is really powerful. And it's some of the most gritty and deep human stuff he ever wrote. The characters in this are maybe even more alive than some of the characters in Lord of the Rings that seem to be so sort of serving an ideal, right? Some of the characters in Lord of the Rings almost seem symbolic of whatever their role is in the story. But these characters are really alive and really wicked, a lot of them. But there's a fascinating, well, let me share a little bit of selection from the text first. So here it is, the beginning of it in the Beowulf meter. Arthur eastward in arms purposed his war to wage on the wild marches, overseas sailing to Saxon lands, from the Roman realm ruin defending. So this is at the beginning of the poem. King Arthur leaves England and marches where? East to what country? Where does he go? Saxon lands, right to modern Germany, right, to make war against the Saxons in their homeland. But while he's there, he gets word that Mordred has betrayed him at home, and that Mordred is trying to forcibly marry Guinevere to take the throne. So he turns around and goes home. The story is really, really tragic and poignant in Tolkien. It is in many of the versions. But here, one of the saddest passages is that Lancelot is such a good friend of Arthur, and he's broken his own heart by his betrayal as well. And Lancelot is waiting for Arthur to call him to come and help. And Arthur is waiting for Lancelot to come without being called, so they're at cross purposes, and he gets home and has to fight a gruesome battle with Mordred. But then take a listen to this interesting bit. These are notes. This is not in the lines of the poem that he finished. These are in a notebook that Tolkien left. He says at the end, the Battle of Camlan, Arthur and Mordred slay one another, Arthur dying in the gloom. So he didn't quite make up his mind. Did Mordred actually slay King Arthur, or was he just fatally wounded but not dead yet? Robbers search the field, Excalibur and the lake, the dark ship comes up the river, Arthur placed upon it. Lancelot has no news. On a grey day of rain, he sets sail with Lionel and comes to Romeril where the crows are still. As he rides along the empty roads, the queen comes down out of Wales and meets him. But he only asks, "Where is Arthur?" She does not know. He turns from her and rides ever west. The hermit by the seashore tells him of Arthur's departure. Lancelot gets a boat and sails west and never returns. Arundel passage. So I don't know if that shocks you as much as it ought. What it means is that way back in the 1920s and 30s, before he ever wrote The Hobbit, Tolkien was thinking of using the King Arthur story as his great legend. Was thinking of having it turn out, oh, Lancelot is that character Arundel that I've been trying to figure out ever since like 1911 when I first encountered him in my school book. So he was thinking, instead of making up a myth to explain the whole backstory and to explain the elves and to explain the language, he was going to use the King Arthur myth. Okay? So that's pretty big, but it's also pretty big that he didn't then, that he put it aside, and instead he went on and made up his whole legend of the elves. But it also shows how his ideas really were to figure out what came before British history and what came before English. Not just to make up a story, but to give a back history that would explain everything that was missing. So then we come to the idea of Numenor. So he played with this idea of King Arthur in the 1920s and 30s. He put it aside. We're not 100% sure why he put it aside. One is it was just really, really hard to write that poetry for such a sustained length, to write an entire book in the Beowulf meter. Another possibility is that he then met Charles Williams, who wrote the great King Arthur poetry in their group, and so maybe he felt like that was Charles' story, and so he didn't want to take it. Another possibility is that it was too Christian for him, which you might think is funny if you know anything about Tolkien, because he was a very devout Roman Catholic and his faith influenced everything he did. But see, he didn't like stories that were actually Christian. He liked stories that symbolized or sort of resonated with it, that had like the same themes but without being explicit. So I don't know if you've noticed that there's never any god or angels or prayer or faith or worship or anything. There's one little prayer, Faramir and his men say, but that's it in the whole of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. You have to dig into the Silmarillion to find out like the religion behind his myth. So that's kind of interesting that maybe the story was too Christian for him, he didn't want to use it. So he put it aside and he wrote The Hobbit. And some of you may know that he did not originally think The Hobbit would connect to this huge mythology that he was making. It was just a story he would tell his kids. And he wrote it, and it was really popular, and the publisher wanted a sequel. And he started writing a sequel, and he said, oh no, it's starting to connect to this whole mythology I've been working on my entire life. Now I really have to draw this story out. He didn't even know what the ring was at first. It wasn't even an evil ring at first. It was just a magic ring. But so as the legends grew and as they became layered with one another, then the story of Numenor grew. And so the story of Numenor is that this is this specific island that's west of Middle-earth. So to put it in simple, real-life terms, it's off the west of the British Isles somewhere. And this is where the High Elves lived, and they were given this gift to live here so close to the gods in such a blessed realm. But they sinned, and they broke the ban, which was not to sail any further west. And so Numenor was foundered and sank under the sea. And so there it dovetails into the legend of Atlantis as well. So he's layering these legends together. He's layering these ideas together. So we also then have, I'm repeating this now from what we did in the quiz. We also have the idea that of the east and west and north and south. And somewhere in one of his letters he says that it should be pretty clear that Middle-earth is actually England. So that ties it back in again to what I was saying about the east and the west in the map here. Okay, so then moving on, we've already talked about Numenor and the Undying Lands and how they connect up. I want to then bring in the other legends that he was working with. So here we have a very weird picture indeed. So later on in his life, Tolkien became a member of this group, the Inklings, with C.S. Lewis and a bunch of their friends. And then during World War II, this other writer, Charles Williams, came and joined them. And he's the one who wrote the great series of King Arthur poems. Now, Charles Williams also invented a mythology, but he didn't create another land, he didn't create elves and so forth. He used the King Arthur legend, and he layered various mythologies in Europe. So, do you see what this odd picture is? Do you see what the two things are? A woman and Europe. So he got an artist to draw this picture for him. And then all throughout his poetry, he refers to each of the countries of Europe by the body part that they match up to. Okay? It's very explicit. It's quite straightforward. Gets a bit awkward at times. But his point was that the human body is a sacred object, and if you are living a life of virtue or a life of vice, those virtues and vices actually are resident in your body. Like you do bad things with your mouth or with your hands or with your eyes or so forth, right? Or you do good things, you do good deeds. And similarly, he saw Europe as being like the kingdom of heaven, and the different countries of Europe were enacting their roles, their virtues and their vices. So it was a way for him to tie them together. Okay, but so what's the most important part of the body? Arguably. The brain, the head probably, right? Where is it?
England.
In England, right? Now he doesn't use this as just straight up praising England. He does say they committed the fallacy of rational virtue. So he says they committed sins with their reason, just as much as being sort of the brains of the empire. But what happens in Williams's myth is that the whole empire, he makes it the Byzantine Empire, the whole empire falls apart. Okay, it's torn by barbarians, Goths and Visigoths and so forth. It's invaded from the south by the Muslim armies, and it's cut off. The body is cut off. So if you know anything about history about Constantinople being cut off from the rest of Europe and the fall of Rome, so if Rome falls, and if Constantinople, Turkey, is cut off, what's happening then? The head is being cut off from the rest of the body, right? But he also had a western direction as well. He also has a land that's off the map, that's not pictured. It's called the land of Saras, which is the land of the Trinity. He took that name straight from Mallory's King Arthur stories as well. But so that's the land of the Trinity, and so his knights set out to seek the Holy Grail, and 3 of them set sail on a ship and make it to Saras. Well, 4 of them, but one is dead when she gets there. So they go to see the Holy Grail in the land of the Trinity. So we get this same sort of theme about this Western longing and this use of geography to carry meaning. And then there's the other inkling, the main inkling, C.S. Lewis. We've got this picture of the planets here. Okay? Does anybody know where this magical land of Avalon is in C.S. Lewis's mythology? Where it is. What's that? West. Sort of, but it's a bit more complicated than that.
No.
No?
That's what I was gonna.
In the Ransom trilogy, the space trilogy. Okay, so I'll say it more specifically. Where does King Arthur go in C.S. Lewis myths? Do you know? Does anybody know? Where King Arthur ends up? So he does not end up on the island of Avalon. He doesn't end up in the land of the Trinity, Saras. Do we know? I see really good thinking.
Venus?
Venus, the planet Venus. Beautiful, very nicely done. So he leaves Earth, King Arthur, and is taken to Venus. And there's a valley, a particular valley on an island in Venus. But do you remember? What was the first thing on the list here? The legends of the Western Isles, right? Venus being that star in the west. So he's picking up on the whole idea of these islands in the west and the star in the west, and yet in Lewis, to go to paradise is to be taken right out of the world, which it might as well be in Williams and Tolkien, because you can't get there by ordinary means. So to end this, I've just done something kind of silly. I've just layered their geographies together, so you can kind of see how they might sort of work. So we've got Williams's very weird female body put over Europe, right? And then where the rational head is, there's Middle Earth, with its own east-west orientation going on inside of it. But then over here we have the island of Numenor, or I really should have Valinor even further off the map, right? And the planet Venus there. And here we have Arundel the mariner trying to sail to get from England to this island or this planet right off the Earth. And that's what I wanted to share. So, thank you very much. Any questions, comments, thoughts, clarifications? I will go and look up the different Atlantis myths and see who has it where and which one.
Well, I've never studied the English ones, so I haven't.
Right. Yep.
And now there's actually a new one. We can talk about it.
Okay. There's the occult revival that was occurring in England from 1895 to around 1930, and they were using Atlantis as part of their source for alchemy, for alchemical power and so forth.
Actually, on a note concerning Atlantis, I saw a documentary once. They found evidence that they believe may prove that Atlantis was a real place. Whether it's the mythology and all that surrounding it is sure, probably not, but it could have been a real location
Great, I
at
hope
one
so.
point in time. No, my question was, and I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I've heard the debate, or I guess the discussion really, of that it was incredible that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were friends because Tolkien supposedly was an atheist or something.
Or was it
Other way around. Lewis was an
Other way
atheist
around.
when they met.
C.S. Lewis was an atheist.
Exactly. Lewis was an atheist when they met, and Tolkien was the most influential person in telling Lewis the ideas that helped him to come to faith.
Okay,
Yeah, along with another friend, Hugo Dyson.
Gotcha.
There was one particular night that they went walking, and they walked until 1 a.m. and talked about mythology of all things. And it was mythology that helped Lewis understand truth. It's
okay.
a fascinating story. I can point you to the letters or documents. If you're
Yeah,
interested.
I'd be interested in that, only because, I also read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the whole series goes with that, and I just found it to be incredible, all the symbology, or,
Yep.
symbols and stuff.
Yeah, which
that.
actually is why Tolkien hated it. Tolkien hated the Narnia Chronicles. He hated them because he hated allegory, and they were way too straightforward, like the Christian story just being enacted by animals. But then also he thought they were a hodgepodge. They were all kinds of mythology thrown together from all different time periods. It drove him crazy. He was like, you can't have Greek and Roman and Norse mythology and Father Christmas all in the same story. It drove him
Okay.
crazy. And he also thought that Lewis just worked way too fast. He thought he was just slapdash. Because Tolkien published one scholarly article in his life and 4 books of fiction, right? And Lewis published that much every year,
Right.
Whereas Tolkien was working over every tiny detail. So yeah, they had a lot of tension. It's amazing that they were best friends.
And it took a Tolkien revival to bring the Lion, the War, or the Witch and the Wardrobe back to the surface.
As being so popular.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
There was definitely a deal from off Tolkien's
Right, because
work.
we finished reading Tolkien, there's not that much, what do we read next? Well, now there's more and more and more since Christopher Tolkien keeps publishing more books every year.
Yeah, but
Right.
I'm glad he did. I'm glad he did
Is
it.
that another discussion?
I-
Let's have it sometime.
6 weeks.
Is it Merlin that comes back in that hideous stream?
Yes, it is. It's
But
Merlin who
that's
comes
not
back.
From Venus or anything?
No, but the main character, Ransom, is the Pendragon. He's the heir of Arthur, so he's the next Arthur. And then at the very end, he's taken away to Venus. He doesn't die, he's taken away in that white casket to be with Arthur in, well, it's got two different names, the valley has two different names. And so the idea at the end of that hideous strength is supposed to be that Jane and Mark conceive a child that night who's going to carry on the line and be the next Pendragon. Yeah.
I was wondering if the space trilogy and Lord of the Rings are connected at all, because in the introduction or forward of that hideous strength, he says, and if you want to know more about Numenor and its true west,
Yes.
you'll have to read.
Yep,
Yeah.
they're definitely connected, and here's
Yeah.
how. They were having a conversation one time over drinks and smokes, and they were saying there are not enough of the books that we like to read nowadays. You know, they loved these sort of like, basically sci-fi from the ancient Greeks is basically what they loved, right? And sci-fi from the Middle Ages. And they said there aren't enough of the books that we really love. I know, let's write them. So they flipped a coin to say one of them was going to write a time travel story, one was going to write a space travel story. And Lewis got space travel, so he wrote Out of the Silent Planet. Tolkien got time travel story. Did he ever finish it? No, because Tolkien hardly ever finished anything. But he began it, The Lost Road, right? And he never finished it. But Lewis, the way it happened to him, like once he started pulling on something, it just came. So he wrote the first one, and they had to write this trilogy. And by the time he was writing the trilogy, Charles Williams had joined them, so the last book in the trilogy is very inspired by Charles Williams' King Arthur stuff, but that's why Numenor comes in as well. He was always like trying to praise his friends by writing them into his works, but sometimes they didn't appreciate it because they felt like he was stealing from them. It's like Numenor, he even misspelled it, right? Because he probably had only heard it read out loud in the Inklings, he probably had never seen it written down.
I was saying, I love the space trilogy, but a lot of times, actually, if I recommended something, they're like,
Right.
yeah.
And they're uneven. The three books are,
Yeah.
they're uneven
Yeah.
to each other.
Yeah.
They're brilliant. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to put on the movie. Anybody who needs to leave, that's fine. I hope you had a good time. Feel free to move around, get comfortable if you need to go get food or drink or whatever. And I'm actually out of here. So it's on 2 discs. So somebody be responsible when the first disc ends. Come up and put on the second. Okay?
Sorry, I'm gonna go around. Sorry, thank you.
I was gonna say that I'm gonna do
We should
the
chat.
first
We need
one, it's like
to
3 hours.
But where are you?
That's fine. I don't know, I think she's starting it right now.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I did.
I read Lord of the Rings on
Yeah, I think that perhaps you
But I saw the
actually
movie
just
first.
cited so we
Oh,
can
really?
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
I'm
I-
not showing you. Like,
I
think it's
actually saw the world
last name, but he's not who said it.
Ralph Bakshi did
Good.
animated started, did the first half of the Lord of the Rings back in 1977.
I think I've heard of it.
And the world premiere of it was at Michigan State. And I was a student there at the time. It was horrible. It was horrible. It's the only animated version of any of this was Rankin Bass.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know who Rankin Bass is. They did Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman.
Did that animated
They did the animated with Orson Bean and everybody else. They did all that stuff. That's all we had. Bakshi did the first half and never finished it. So up until Peter Jackson, there was no mass media for Tolkien at all.
Well, you know, it's a big project.
Okay.
It's, you know, and the smartest thing they ever did was to make 3 3-hour movies.
I know.
Because you can't really do
Can you
it.
imagine shortening those movies into like something bite-sized?
Well, can you imagine shortly what we got here? And that's a third of the size.
It's not in there.
So,
Did you put it in the same
no, but
box?
I started reading
Just in the rough draft Dropbox?
early 70s.
Yeah.
And I go like,
Not in the spare notes.
I have an illustrated version. Like
3 volumes? Or
no.
is it a big?
It's hardcover and it has like, you know, like kind of paintings and stuff, like has big illustrations. I forget what the artist's name is.
We'll be in touch.
John something.
Email tomorrow.
So it's really good though. He actually has some art on it.
Oh, okay, so that's more, that makes sense.
And I think it's more like, yeah, it has lots of very
Hey, nice
beautiful
to
art.
meet you. Thanks for
And on the cover, I mean on the dust jacket, it's a picture of Smog coiled up on the, you know.
You should somehow.
Yeah.
Yes.
On,
And I hear you're an actor.
Should somehow try to formulate, we used to have it was called Chicken Society.
yeah,
If you've ever heard
yeah.
that or not.
Send it to me.
I
Get
found
my email
out about
address
it
from your mom.
because they did this
I'll look at it right now.
It said Bill Pittsburgh.
And when I get time.
And it was September 23rd, 1976.
And,
Without bite.
what are you looking for? Are you
It's
looking
just
for
weird.
like somebody to say,
I
hey,
was in a costume.
Yeah.
No, it's in the middle of that academe section of it.
He shouted out that it was his 11th
If I
get up in the morning.
That's what I actually
They
do
would
for
do
a
that.
living. You can pay me for
They
that.
went play
So
ball.
that is on.
I really don't remember.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's whatever happens, keep it up.
She did something that was a lot of fun. And I've been studying this for 40 years.
Just that it's longer than.
You associated the priest that raised Tolkien with, oh, I had never done that.
Wait, did I? I didn't say that.
No, you didn't say it.
Did I imply it?
You implied it.
How did I imply it?
Because the ability, or the fact that the priest separated
Oh,
Edith and John and then let them see each other for a long time.
that's what, that's
That's
what
what,
I told
that's what
them.
Elrond did with Aragorn. And so I never even made that